Passionate, outspoken, insightful. Ariva Martin is an award-winning civil rights attorney, best-selling author, legal commentator, and America's advocate. Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report.
Good morning and welcome to our viewers in the U.S. and around the world. To kick off this morning's broadcast, do me a favor. Please share the show with your online friends or start a viewing party. And remember to post a comment or question. Your voice matters, and I want to hear from you. History was made yesterday when Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden selected my friend and California's junior senator Kamala Harris to be his vice presidential running mate. Women and men all over this country were celebrating this historic selection. The first African American and Asian American to be selected for a top spot on a national political ticket. And she's a woman. Yes. As exciting as this is for little girls and women of all races and ethnicities and socioeconomic classes, the big question now is, can the Biden-Harris ticket win the White House in November? Even though Biden is leading in some national and regional polls by as much as 8 to 10%, many pundits worry that this year's election will be marred by rampant voter suppression efforts from foreign interference, the dismantling of the U.S. postal system, broad-scale social media misinformation campaigns, and the strategic closing of polling places and the elimination of early voting across this country. Will these efforts deprive millions of Americans of their hard-fought constitutional right to vote? Let's discuss. My first guest is a former California State Assembly member and chief strategist for the African American Voter Rep Project, the largest urban voter registration, education, and participation project for African Americans in California. He is none other than Sebastian Ridley Thomas. Good morning, Sebastian.
Good morning, Ariva. Thank you so much for having me today.
So I've got to ask you the million-dollar question. What was your initial reaction when you learned that our senator, our friend Kamala Harris, was going to be Joe Biden's vice presidential pick?
Well, my initial reaction is we now have the opportunity for a margin of hope election. The Black vote in the United States and in California is really the constituency that is the majority maker and they can make things happen. So in Milwaukee, in Philadelphia, in Detroit, we have a shot. In Miami, in Tallahassee, we have a shot. In Charlotte, and in even parts of Ohio, we have a shot with her candidacy as the number 2 pick on the ticket.
So I want to read you something that I recently read, Sebastian, in the Atlantic magazine. And it said intentional voter suppression and unintentional suppression of the vote will collide in November. What does this mean? Like, what does this whole concept of voter suppression mean? We hear so much about it, but I think people are probably confused when they hear that word voter suppression. So help us understand what voter suppression is and what that comment means about, intentional voter suppression colliding in November.
Yeah, so intentional would be those structures that make sure that people are purged from the rolls if they haven't voted before, if their address is changed, that they don't get a provisional ballot, or that somehow their ballot is lost in the mail and not counted. Unintentional voter suppression are the pandemic protocols that may be limiting. They are the reduction of polling places, both for efficiency, cost, and because of the pandemic. Not staffing the polling places well, so they have long lines, given that voting is not a legal holiday for most employers and most employees. And then so many of the things are changing. Every week we're getting updates from registrar voters all over California and the country and secretaries of state. And of course, then there's the steady misinformation from the White House, which really does complicate and confuse the situation. So that's the collision. Some of it is intentional in parts of the South, parts of the Midwest. Some of it is unintentional, I'd say administrative error or miscalculation that really does reduce the number of people that vote.
And how does the chipping away, Sebastian, at the Voting Rights Act of 1965, How does that play into the suppression efforts that we see, and particularly as it relates to Black and Brown communities?
Oh, a great deal, because at one point the federal government, through the Department of Justice, when we had an attorney general who viewed themselves as a public servant rather than a personal lawyer to the president, would actually review voting plans every election cycle. And one county in Mississippi challenged that, or maybe it was Tennessee, Shelby County. And the Supreme Court gutted that provision, and we've seen some rampant voter suppression system. We've seen laws where you have to produce an ID, a particular type of ID that is not easily accessible for older voters, for students, for the disabled, and the like. We see all of these cost-cutting measures that make it harder to vote. We see when the post office is going through its challenges, there is no way to make up for the delivery of vote by mail ballots, and then a lack of education about how ballots are changing. That's what was previously done, is that we had a national standard for voting. We had enforcement if states tried to do otherwise, and there was accountability and confidence that voters had, the public had, that somebody was looking out for them.
And we just showed that picture of John Lewis, the late John Lewis, a civil rights
Hero.
icon who spent his life advocating, for the rights to vote. And he's standing there talking about the Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2019. What impact, if that piece of legislation can make its way through Congress, get signed by this president, what impact will that have on, millions of Americans' right to vote?
If that were to be elected, I think that that is enacted and signed into law, that would enfranchise and ensure the voting franchise to millions of voters, primarily African American, Latino, and rural voters who have a lack of access to the ballot. Some people built their campaigns on the idea that fewer people have to vote. Donald Trump is not competitive if more people vote. And that's what some of his allies are counting on, is not passing what I think is now called the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. So it's going to mean tens of millions of people, and that will transform politics in this country.
Yeah, I want to bring into the conversation now Latasha Brown. She's the co-founder of Black Voters Matter Fund, and she's been on the front line, registering and ensuring that the vote is turned out in states across this country. Good morning, Latasha.
Good morning. I'm happy to be here.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us. I got to ask you the big question too. As an African-American woman, someone that's been on the front lines fighting for, the right to vote, what was your reaction when you learned that Senator Kamala Harris was going to be on the ticket with Joe Biden?
I was ecstatic. The bottom line is I thought about so much so that when I got the news, it kind of, I don't know why I was shocked, because in some ways I was expecting it, but I needed that moment that I actually cried. I actually shed tears because I thought about just how significant that moment was for Black women. I thought about my grandmother when it happened. I thought about my grandmother and so many other women in my family, and in line, all of the Black women who have been marginalized and have been minimized from being able to even participate in the process. So I am actually ecstatic about it.
Yeah, I heard someone put it this way. They say Black women, particularly, Black Democratic women, have been king makers. And now with the selection of Kamala Harris, we are now queen makers. So I thought that was just the perfect way to summarize, what has been the reality of Black women, because we have helped so many candidates cross that finish line. And they have been male candidates, and we're grateful for the great work that men have done. So this isn't about male bashing, but it is about recognizing the role that Black women have played in the Democratic Party. And now we get to celebrate, having our great senator on that ticket. But I want to ask you, Latasha, when Kamala Harris ran for president, I was very much a part of her campaign. And one of the things we were constantly fighting against were the massive misinformation campaign that was run against her online. There were trolls coming out the woodwork, misrepresenting her record as a prosecutor and as attorney general. And now reports are in that we should expect to see 3,500 Facebook, Instagram ads attempting to sway this election. That's what we saw in 2016. And they say we can expect to see that plus some in 2020. So how do we deal with that form of voter suppression, which is this massive misinformation campaign that happens online?
I think that's part of our work. I think that's why it's really important that we're supporting organizations, civic organizations and groups that are doing this kind of work, because oftentimes we're the ones that are actually engaging people so that we can counter that misinformation by we have relationships with those communities, and being able to counter that information by giving information that through those campaigns that we can actually offset that. I can tell you, as somebody who's a native of Alabama, when misinformation campaigns, that's nothing new. I remember being in an election years ago, almost 20 years ago, where the Ku Klux Klan literally was put out thousands of flyers of information about wrong voting date, all kinds of things, right? But we could counter that because we had a relationship with the community that trusted us. We were a trusted messenger. And so I think it's really important that when we're talking about Black radio, that is going to be important that we have messages and trusted messengers really talking about this election cycle. I think it's going to be really important that those organizations that are doing legal work and challenging some of the, whether it's Facebook or some of the other platforms, about allowing them just to spread information that is wrong. And I also think that we're going to have to be organizing. The best way to offset that is we've got to organize. We got to get on the ground. And the one thing that has happened since yesterday is I'm even more fired up. I'm even more committed to that. We have the opportunity, but we've got to do the work. We have to organize, and we have to counter all of these mixed messages that are coming to our community.
No, absolutely, you're right. And I love how you talk about trusted messengers, because it's so important, not just where people get their information from, but who they get that information from. And we've seen, Sebastian, we saw this in 2016, and we're starting to see it now in 2020, this whole effort to recharacterize Black Lives Matter. We've seen memes that are going around suggesting that if you support Black Lives Matter, that you somehow shouldn't vote, that your vote, doesn't matter, or you're going to actually, one said you're going to be screwed if you vote. So how do we get younger voters, particularly those that have been out on the front lines, with Black Lives Matters protesters, to understand that it's important to translate that power on the streets into electoral power, power at the voting ballot, at the voting box in November, and not fall prey to those false, memes that we see all over social media.
Indeed. And it's also just making sure that we get voices that are validators, not unlike what Latoya said. Colin Kaepernick once said he wasn't going to vote. He's since reverted to a position of civic engagement. Our motto at AvRep is that we're going to march to the polls in November, and we're going to start early voting. We're going to be aware of when our ballots come 35 days before the election and be informed so that we can get our ballots in the mail. In California, you don't have to return your ballot with a stamp. It's already pre-sorted and paid. So it's easy enough, if you have a mailbox or access to one, to a mail drop-off location, to deliver that, and then your vote is going to be banked. So it's civic education, it's reinforcement with community validators. All of those things are going to make a substantial difference, I think, in combating what you see with, I call it the attack of the bots. That's and right. They may try to raise their head, but the Black Voter Project, AvRep, Black PAC, Collective PAC, any number of organizations, the good thing is that we have footprint now, and we are stronger than we were in 16 as a collection of organizations, in order to have clear messaging. Say, if you have a question, call this voter hotline. If it's the NAACP Legal Defense Fund or the ACLU or vote.com or When We All Vote, shout out to the First Lady, who is also trying to improve civic engagement, and the broad array of individuals who have said, okay, Black Lives Matter, I get that. I'm an influencer. This is how we translate it in economics, in social activities, as school begins. Whether it be hybrid or online or in person in some cases. How does all of that translate into what we see in November? And we're just at the stages where I think we have the opportunity to be critical thinkers. A part of the misinformation last time in 16 was that we didn't have enough time to realize that we had fake news sources or manipulative information going about. Now at home, we have a bit more time to digest this information and say, wait a minute, we're talking about racial justice, economic opportunity, and equity, and there are ways to get there besides bashing a presidential ticket, particularly for Black voters, that is more aligned with Black freedom.
I do want to offer too, I want to add one point to this too, is that we also have to acknowledge that we've had the largest uprising in this country in all 50 states, multiracial, multi-generational, and people have been attacking, there have been forces that have been attacking the Black Lives Matter movement since its inception. And instead of it devolving, it's actually gotten stronger, because I do think that the young folks who are leading this movement have become sophisticated in their messaging, that they have moved from not just in terms of we're talking about mobilization for protests, but they're building real organization. And so I think that's two different things. I think we're in a different place in 2016, where a lot of the movement was in response. It was new and people were responding. I think over the years, what you've seen, a lot of the movement, many of those young people are connected to organizations. They're doing work with organizations, and it's a different kind of, I think, a firewall that is up this year. We still have to counter it, and we still got to do the work, but I do think that we're in a better position now than we were in 2016.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you, Latasha. I can remember being in 2016, the kind of battles and fights we were having with particularly, millennials around the importance of voting. And we're seeing some of those same millennials now being on the ground, doing the organizing themselves. But Sebastian mentioned, fake news, and there's so much fake news that comes at us all day, every day. And one piece of fake news, Latasha, that we hear from the president on the regular is that he has done more for Black people than anyone, maybe with the exception of Abraham Lincoln. So somebody that's sitting at home that says, well, the job, unemployment numbers for African Americans, was at its lowest point, under Trump pre-pandemic. And, we did see, as he claims, Black home ownership increase. How do you get Black people to understand when they hear Donald Trump say that is a blatant lie, the biggest piece of misinformation, ever spoken by anyone? How do we fight back against that statement? Because he says it all the time. Now, it's become a part of his talking points.
Yeah, I think I got 3 quick points. One, I don't even think is a really good talking point. The bottom line is, during the enslavement of Africans, during slavery, there was 100% employment. Right? Black people working and having Black folks working is not anything new. The question is, are people working in a way that they're getting fairly compensated for their wages? Are people working and being able to pay their rent? Are people working and being able to take care of their families? The bottom line is, most of the folks in our community, and many people, millions of people, are severely underpaid, right? There's a manipulation. Anybody that does data know that you can manipulate numbers. So at the end of the day, when you really boil down the numbers, he's not only is he lying, it's an exaggeration, but just if he's basing all of the economic prosperity on employment, that in itself is fundamentally flawed. Secondly, though, is if you also look at, he's not only not been good for Black Americans, he's not been good for Americans. So at the end of the day, when we're looking at over 1,000 people that are dying every day because of COVID-19, when we're looking at there's 30 million people right now who are unemployed, right? When we're looking at where their benefits have been cut down and folks are really on the verge of getting evicted, right? When we're looking at this country that he loves to brag is the wealthiest country in America, but look at its people suffering, that's what we should be judging him by, right? The talking points, we can't follow his talking points because he has shown there's enough evidence to demonstrate that he has convinced all of us that he is a habitual liar. So I'm not even sure why we're still listening to him. But at the point, I think it's really important for us to really push what the real issues are. And as we're seeing people suffering in our community, as we see people dying in our community, we hold him accountable for that. And that's the discussion. We should be leading the discussion as the citizens in this country.
No, and great point, Latasha. And you mentioned COVID-19, and obviously we have all been impacted both from a physical standpoint and an economic standpoint by COVID-19. So I want to ask you, Sebastian, you talked about those unintentional voter suppression mechanisms that are at play, and I would put COVID-19 as one of them. No one created this virus. Obviously, the handling of it at the federal level has been, an abysmal failure. But how is COVID-19 impacting voter registration and possibly voter turnout? Do you see it suppressing your ability as a voting, registration organization to really get out and get people to register?
Oh yeah, no question. Because our in California, we've had so many lockdowns for such a period of time. Our where we would normally gather, either knocking on doors or at common gathering places, is very difficult. And we really shied away from gathering at grocery stores or other essential locations because we know what the anxieties are. The way that it has given us an interesting way forward is that it's forced everyone on the digital. All of us know how to use Zoom, WebEx, or one of their competitors, Google Meets. And we have online voter registration capabilities in California, primarily through the Secretary of State is authorized Rock the Vote as one of a couple of vendors that can do online voter registration. So that's what's really given us the ability to keep up. And we're going to have to register several thousand people in African Americans in just LA County alone, and a little less than a couple thousand in the rest of the state, because people have moved since the last election, and they need to make sure that their information is appropriately accounted for. The other thing that's going to be a little difficult is if individuals have moved across county lines, which is common in California, then we have to make sure that their ballots are not inappropriately handled by the registrars that receive them. So that's a big thing that we're paying attention to. That if somebody votes in Kern County, Ventura County, Orange County, San Bernardino, or Riverside counties, that those registrars get those ballots to the LA County registrar, and in other places like the Bay Area as well. Because what some people may or may not realize is really elections are administered locally. It's a hyper local activity, and then it's reported up to the state, and it obviously is supervised in some limited capacity by the federal government. So we are hyper locally focused to make sure we can still get registration in through digital platforms.
And I want to ask you, Latasha, you're in the South, and I remember watching you after the Georgia primary and talking about how frustrated you were with those long lines and the early closing of polling places. What are you anticipating for November? Given COVID-19 and the fear that so many people have about going out, the whole mask wearing, social distancing, how are you combating that, particularly in southern states?
We are talking about early information. We have been telling people that they've got to vote early so that we can actually get in front of this. I think the two keys are voting early and giving the right information to help people give information. And I know when we talk about the South, but I want to let people know that I love to say, welcome to the South. In some ways, we are all living in, if you are under the Canadian line right now, you are living in the South. Like when you look at the policies, even when I'm talking about, when you're looking at the policies, who's running the Senate? That Kentucky, a senator from Kentucky, a senator from South Carolina. Like we can be as progressive as we want to in pockets until we really recognize that we've got to literally do the work locally, but that we're all connected. And we've got to get some of these Southern long-standing conservatives out of office. That is because they are shaping policy for all of us. But I think when we're talking about voter suppression across the board, it is a spectrum. It looks one way in Georgia, but it can look another way in California. It can look in a way that when you're not providing a bilingual information for folks around voting, that's a form of voter suppression. When you are not providing, when the polls are closing, that's a form of voter suppression. My point is anything that impedes the free and fair access to the ballot is a form of voter suppression. And what we find is where there are communities of color, I can guarantee you that there's some form of voter suppression that has been in that process. We are seeing it all over the country, not just in the South. We see it in New York. We get calls every day from places in the Midwest and even out in the West Coast. I'm raising this because we have to really see that this isn't just isolated incidents. There is a coordinated strategy, right, that to literally marginalize and minimize the power of the vote of people of color, particularly since there's a major demographic shift in this country. And we have to acknowledge that democracy is actually under attack, and voter suppression is the tool to use it to dismantle.
And I worry, Latasha and Sebastian, about, we're hearing, because of COVID-19, because of the economic devastation, hundreds of thousands of people are facing eviction. So
That's
if
right.
you are evicted, or I had some guests on my show on Friday talking about multi-generational homes in the Latinx community, and how so many of those people, and so many Latinx individuals have had to move in with different relatives because of the economic devastation. So if you're moving around, being evicted, where are you voting? How are you getting your ballot? We talk about ballots coming to you, but if you just got put out of your apartment, and you no longer have that apartment, and you're living with a relative, how are you getting your ballot?
We need.
Go ahead, Latasha.
As people are transient, if they are whatever the address that they're using, some people may have to re-register to vote. I think that is really important. If one of the messages that we can send out is for people to check their status on vote.org, to really be able to check their status. But also, I always tell people, find a political home, connect with a civic engagement organization that can help you, because it's a lot to navigate when you're in the midst of being displaced where you are. But it is really critical that you vote, because part of the issue why people are facing eviction right now is because we have a government that will spend trillions of dollars on war. We have a government that will find trillions of dollars overnight to save the Federal Reserve, but will not do the same thing for its people. And so it's not that the resources aren't in America, they're here. It's how those resources are deployed that makes the difference. And so what we've got to recognize, it's critical for all of us to vote, particularly those who are being victimized by the system right now. It is important for you to vote so that we can start getting representation, to really have people in office that have a radical reimagining of what America can be, where it puts its people before it puts the stock market.
Good point, Latasha. I want to ask you, Sebastian, about Kanye West. So we've seen in at least 5 states or so, Republican operatives actually going into registrars' offices, submitting signed petitions to make sure that Kanye makes it onto ballots. And there being some concern that he could be a spoiler candidate that siphons off, maybe as many as 1.5 million votes, the way that Jill Stein did in 2016. How do we, educate people about what Republicans are doing with respect to Kanye, and why it's a bad idea if you're even, remotely considering voting for Kanye?
Well, it's a bit of a nuanced conversation for our community because he's popular. He was recently determined by popular finance magazines to be a billionaire, and he does inspire a significant following. I think his association with President Trump is going to make a lot of people skeptical of all races, but particularly in the African-American community. And we want to be gentle to Kanye, but we don't want to allow the misinformation about his candidacy to cloud our voters' judgment. So that's the struggle that we're facing right now. And I think, as Latasha mentioned, the civic education for African-American Voter Registration Education Participation Project, we do partisan work. So we will articulate a Biden-Harris line means one thing, and anybody else means Donald Trump for 4 more years, and more misinformation and mishandling of crises that would otherwise be much more intelligently managed, engaged, and compassionately dispatched. So that's what we have to do, is we have to have a real contrast to say your vote matters. It will be transformative. If you don't think it does, realize that Donald Trump's margin of victory via the Electoral College was roughly only 30,000 votes in 3 states. And that every barbershop, beauty shop, precinct, church, community, now Zoom meeting, you could have said neighborhood bar before the pandemic, is critical to what the outcome will be. So the birthday party is not going to be a joke. And it is clear that people who are working against the interests of African Americans are attempting to promote his candidacy and that of his running mate, both of whom are from Wyoming by virtue of what they've submitted, I think.
And Latasha, before I let you go, I know that John Lewis, bigger than life, figure in the civil rights movement, and definitely the voting rights movement, is one of your idols. And As I told you before we went on air, I had the pleasure of watching you pay tribute to John in song. So before I let you go, I'd love for you to grace us with your musical talents and just show us how much John meant to you.
Well, the first thing I did right was the day I started to fight. Keep your eyes on the prize and hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize and hold on, hold on. That's what we got to remember. We just got to hold on, y'all. Do the work and hold on. And
We got to get for that, Latasha. That was good, girl. Thank you so much, Latasha, for the great work you're doing in the South and all over this country. And Sebastian Ridley Thomas, one of my favorite people in this fight for social justice. So thanks to both of you for making sure that we turn out in November and we turn out in a really big way. Again, thanks for joining me this morning. All right, nothing like getting some inspiration about voting and the importance of voting. So again, I love having guests that are so multi-talented. And that pretty much describes my next guest. He is a legendary Democratic strategist. He's the director of the USC Dorrance Fife Center for the Political Future, and he is none other than Bob Shrum. Good morning, Bob.
Good morning, how are you? And please don't ask me to sing.
I won't ask you, and I hope no one ever asks me because that would be a big, big mistake. But so happy to have a chance to sit down with you, Bob. You and I do a lot of TV together, and we're always talking about politics. So I love to have an opportunity to pick your brain. So I got to ask you the question I'm asking all of my guests this morning. What was your reaction when you learned that Joe Biden has selected Kamala Harris to be his running mate?
Well, I always thought he would. I said it on television. I said it to reporters. I was thrilled by it. It's a historic moment when you have the first woman of color on a national ticket, and she's African American, she's Indian American, Asian American. I think it's a wonderful moment. My other reaction was Mike Pence better start worrying about that debate. Because she's going to be very effective in the debate. She's charismatic. I think she will do a tremendous job of conveying the Biden-Harris message.
Total agreement about that Mike Pence debate. He's got a lot of homework to do. I don't even know if he has enough time to catch up to be ready for Kamala. But good luck to him. But I want to ask you, Bob, we have a lot of work to do as Democrats, obviously, and we only have about 84, 83 days to do it. And before we can, move that historical candidate into the White House, we've got to, overcome some hurdles. And there was a recent report that, Americans are not very confident that there is going to be a fair election in November. And a lot of it has to do with, what's happening with the dismantling of the post office and this whole debate that Trump has going on between absentee ballots and mail-in ballots. So help us understand, is there a difference between voting, absentee or, voting by mail? And why is this, false narrative being put forth by Trump?
Well, Trump wants to come up with an argument to say that the election was rigged, the election was stolen. So he's invented a false dichotomy between absentee ballots and mail-in ballots. There's a long tradition of mail-in ballots in this country. It goes back to the Civil War when the Union soldiers all voted absentee, and they actually voted by mail. I don't even know if they called it absentee. They just voted by mail. And they were the margin of Abraham Lincoln's victory over George McClellan. California, as you know, very heavily votes by mail. Oregon votes entirely by mail. Donald Trump votes by mail. So this is all part of a much wider effort to delegitimize the election and disenfranchise people. Part of this, I think, reflects the demographic change in America. California has already become a majority non-white state. America's going to become a majority non-white party. And as Stuart Stevens, the longtime Republican consultant, points out, as long as Republicans remain a white party and use racist tropes in campaigns, they can't win fair elections. So the only thing you can do is try to suppress vote in a whole variety of ways. I mean, I remember in 2004, we got calls during the day that in African-American precincts in Ohio, people were having to wait hours and hours to vote. And that's still going on. The same thing was going on college campuses. You have people trying to prevent college students from registering where they go to school. You have ridiculous ID requirements. You know, you got to bring your social security card, your birth certificate, all this other stuff. And, you know, worst of all, in a way, in Florida, you effectively have a poll tax. The citizens of the state voted to allow felons who had served their time to vote. And so the Republican legislature and Ron DeSantis, the governor, who is by my lights the worst governor in America and is literally killing people in the way he's dealing with COVID, they came up with this scheme where you have to pay all your back taxes, all your back fines, all this stuff. It's nothing but a poll tax, which we thought we got rid of with a constitutional amendment. So it goes across a whole range of things to try to keep people from voting. And then, of course, you've got, and you were discussing this earlier, something like putting Kanye West in the campaign to try to siphon votes away from people and destroy the power of, for example, Black votes. And you know, Trump has an approval rating among Black people of something like 4 to 8%. I'd be surprised if he gets 5% of the African-American vote. So they're trying to siphon votes away.
And you mentioned Florida, Bob, and one of the things that Trump likes to do, because DeSantis is his guy, is tout how well Florida handles vote by mail, but yet he's suing a state like Nevada, alleging that their vote by mail system is somehow fraught with fraud. So, you know, can you talk about the fact that, you know, voting fraud is pretty much a non-issue in U.S. voting, but yet it has been weaponized by the Trump administration?
Sure. I mean, this is a guy who thinks that that he won the popular vote in 2016, that somehow or other there were millions of false ballots cast. There's no evidence whatsoever for any significant vote fraud in this country. Basically, the Trump doctrine is mail voting is okay in Republican states. That's because, by the way, they figured out that a lot of older people in Florida who might vote Republican vote by mail. And so he had to draw a distinction. And they're lying about Nevada. They're saying that in Nevada you'll be able to vote after the election. That's not true. They're saying there's no verification process. That's not true. So, but it doesn't matter, because it doesn't matter to them, because the whole Trump administration is built on a mountain of lies. It's a mountain of lies about everything from building a wall to negotiating with North Korea, to whether or not COVID was going to be a danger in this country, to the fact that he actually held a briefing the other day celebrating the great condition of the economy when the economy is in a deep recession. So lying is not anything that bothers them. And being fact-checked is not anything that bothers them. They just don't care.
Yeah, and we see that happening on a daily basis, Bob. And one of the things that I am concerned about when we talk about intentional voter suppression, it's the messaging coming out of the White House. And recently, Trump has been tweeting about quote unquote suburban, you know, housewives, and trying to message to them that somehow if there's a Biden administration, that their property values are going to go down, and that all of these, you know, unsavory, you know, undesirable characters are going to move into the suburbs. So I do wonder about, is that message resonating with suburban white women? Because we know to win the 2020 election, we need suburban white women in suburbs outside of Philadelphia and Detroit and Milwaukee. And, you know, those women play a critical role in this election. Is this messaging going to suppress their vote?
I don't think so. But first of all, I got to say it's shameful. It's overtly racist. It echoes the worst of George Wallace and people like that. Look, this election is about COVID. This election is about the economy. This election is about criminal justice reform. Those are the things that are top of mind for people. If you're a suburban, and I love that he talks about suburban housewives. I mean, it's the language of the 1950s, and that's what he thinks in. If you're a suburban woman and you're raising kids and you probably have a job, one of the things you're concerned about now is who can bring this country together in this period of terrible racial strife. You're concerned about who can handle not just COVID, but the danger of another pandemic, of something else like this happening again. Who can put the...
Let me just stop you there. I want to interject with this. Jane Elliott, who I'm sure who you know, was on this program, and she talked about suburban white women basically voting based on, you know, what their husband tells them, how their husband tells them to vote, and voting their pocketbook. And she says that we can't count on suburban white women to vote, you know, in for liberal policies or maybe the Democratic ticket, because their husbands who are favorable to Donald Trump are going to dictate their votes. So do you think Jane is off when she makes that?
Yep, I do. There would be no gender gap if that were true. And in all the polling that we're seeing now, and we're about to start up our USC Dornsife poll again, our daily tracking poll, women much more strongly support Democrats than men do. Women have a much bigger problem with Donald Trump. Now, there is a cohort of unmarried white women who are very, very Democratic. But I think we passed the point in America where we're living in an I Love Lucy world and the man tells the woman how to vote. I don't think that's true.
Did those women vote for Hillary in 2016, Bob?
No, they voted for Trump.
So why do you think they're not going to vote for Trump again in 2020? What's different?
I think Hillary was treated very unfairly in many ways, but she had very high unfavorable ratings among those women. They didn't like her, and they didn't like Trump particularly, but in the end, they decided that they would go with Trump. I think if James Comey had not done what he did a week before the election, Hillary probably would have eked it out. But the other thing, and we can't, Democrats, you know, are always, especially after 2016, traumatized and worried, right?
That's why I asked the question. We are traumatized and we're worried about those white women in the suburbs voting the way we see them express their commitment to Black Lives Matter and racial equality. But we just want to make sure we can count on their vote to be consistent.
Well, we can't count on it. We have to earn it. We have to work for it. It's you know, but if you look at the 2018 midterm elections, they were a huge factor in Democrats taking back the House, and taking back the House by a substantial margin. I think they worry about Trump. You know, I said to somebody the other day that going back generations, this chant at conventions, and of course there'll be no chanting at conventions this year, this chant at conventions, 4 more years, has always been a triumphalist chant. I think 4 more years, sends shivers up and down the spines of a lot of independent and suburban voters, not just Democrats. And I would bet you that will not be a Donald Trump slogan.
And my last question for you, Bob, is the Lincoln Project. So we've seen these never Trumpers, these Republicans, you know, reformed Republicans who have now formed this pretty powerful organization, and they are dropping these compelling ads almost daily. And they did a brilliant one for Kamala Harris yesterday. What impact do you think the Lincoln Project is going to have on those independent voters and those never Trumpers, Republicans who probably have never voted for a Democratic candidate? Do you think they're going to vote for, you know, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in this election?
If you get 10 or 12% of Republicans stripped away from Trump, very hard for him to win the election. The Lincoln Project and people involved in it are friends of mine, even if I don't agree with them politically on a lot over many years. And Republican voters against Trump, which involves Bill Kristol and Mike Murphy, my co-director at the USC Center for the Political Future, they are making very powerful ads that actually take a lot of the burden off of the Biden campaign. The Biden campaign has this ally that's running these negative ads against Trump, although the one about Kamala was obviously positive, running these ads. So the Biden campaign has to do less of it. I think they will have a big impact. I think there will be, if you look at the internals of all the data we have so far, Trump is losing independents. He's losing suburban women. I believe, you would know more about this than I do, but I believe that the African-American vote is going to be very energized in this election. I don't think it's going to be I don't, in 2016.
2008 levels like we saw with Obama in 2008, where the Black vote was actually over 65%, which I think we'll see those numbers again. I want to ask you one last question. I said that was my last, but I do have a last
That's all right.
How is Biden-Harris ticket going to poll with independents? Because I didn't see any, when I was thinking about the VP pick, I wanted to see polling coming out of those swing states, because this isn't a national election. Everybody that knows politics know this is going to come down to 6 to 8, key states. So as much as we may get excited in California and New York, it's really not going to be about California and New York. So have you seen any polling coming out of those key battleground states that really show what a Biden-Harris ticket will do compared to a Trump-Pence ticket?
You'll see that in the next several weeks. You won't see it right now, but I can assure you that the Biden campaign, as part of the vetting process, did a lot of that polling in those swing states and nationally to assess the impact of various candidates. There's a belief, and I happen to share it, that Harris is going to be a very popular figure in the suburbs with women, with white women, and not just in the minority communities.
Great. Well, I'll be looking for that polling. I know you are the guru of polls, so we'll be looking to see what those polls say, because we got to keep our eye on the prize, and we've got to stay focused on those battleground states this time around in a way that I think we didn't do in 2016. But thank you so much, Bob, for sitting down with me. Your insights are always invaluable. Keep educating us and keep those great polls out.
No, you keep fighting, because you're fabulous. The only thing I won't do is sing "Eyes on the Prize." Take care.
All right, Bob. We'll talk soon.
Okay.
All right,
thanks.
legendary Bob Shrum. He's been around for a long time. So when you're talking about politics, you need to go and talk with the experts. But you also got to talk with students, because students have been on the forefront of social change throughout history, from civil rights to voting rights. But despite high voter turnout in 2018, only 28% of students age 18 to 24 voted. My next guest is on a mission to change that. She is a student organizer at Howard University and was part of the public interest research group Student New Voters Project at Lansing Community College in Lansing, Michigan. Welcome, Kaitlyn. Good morning, Kaitlyn. How are you? I think you got to unmute yourself, Kaitlyn. That's okay.
Sorry about that. Good morning.
Oh, no problem. Welcome to the show, Kaitlyn. I've got to ask you, like I've asked all of my other guests, you're sitting there proudly in your Howard University t-shirt.
Yes.
Go Bison. So I know it meant the world to Howard students and graduates to have Kamala Harris, selected by Joe Biden for this ticket. But what did it mean to you personally as a young African-American Howard student?
It personally meant a lot to me that we're getting way more representation in presidential candidacy, because, in all of our history, we've never had a Black female president or even VP in such a high stature. And for her to come from an HBCU, it just shows all of the little Black girls out there who want to go into politics, who want to go into our legal systems, that they can do it, that their faces do matter, their voices do matter, which I feel is something that a lot of Black girls have had to struggle with, feeling like they matter in this society particularly. So yeah, it was really exciting, and I'm really happy to see the progress that she's about to make. And
yeah. Well, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I have 2 daughters, and they're, college students. And I just think for every Black girl that's ever had a dream, every Latinx girl, every Asian girl, any girl that's ever had a dream, that they now know that that dream can come true. I want to talk a little about the work that you did at Lansing Community College. You are on the front lines out there registering voters. So what are you hearing from students? Are they enthused about this 2020 election? Are they apathetic? What are students thinking about the election as you're out there on the front lines talking to them?
Yes, I'm hearing a lot of different opinions, especially about the presidential election. I know I got a lot of my peers registered to vote for the primaries. And yeah, we did see a lot of good turnout for that. But in terms of the presidential election, I feel as though what Kamala and Joe Biden are going to have to work towards is gaining the trust of the youth vote, because a lot of them are looking at the mass incarceration rates, are looking at Kamala's history in terms of being a prosecutor and things like that. So I'm hearing positive and negative things. I'm really hoping that, you know, as time goes on and as we get closer to election time, that more moves or more work is being done to target youth voters within their election or within their campaign process. But yeah, I'm hearing good and bad things from my peers.
Well, thank you for that honesty. And that's so important to know. We've got about 84 days and we definitely have time to turn this around. What do you think would be the most impactful for students? What do they want to hear from, you know, all of the candidates that's going to move them to register and actually go to the polls in November?
I think they honestly want to hear about them addressing kind of our current state and society. As you know, we have a lot of problems within our law enforcement system. We have a lot of problems with education, healthcare, things that affect students and student voices. So hearing about those things, I feel as though would really create a better vision for students on who to vote for and who to pursue within the upcoming election process. I know personally, a lot of my friends and I have been protesting and organizing on the front lines with that, and not really hearing much from higher up political forces. So definitely hearing opinions, hearing what they're going to do about it, actually setting things in stone would be a great influence.
So getting those voices out was easier pre-COVID. So you could have surrogates, you could have the candidates themselves, you know, do a big college tour. We saw that happen when Obama was running. Now in this era of COVID, you know, how do you think that's going to impact students, many of whom I imagine aren't even back on college campuses? So how are you going to reach those students who are dispersed all over the country at this time?
Definitely. Well, even though we are in the age of COVID, we are also in the age of great technology that can be used to reach out to students. I know that Howard University is hosting a lot of virtual career fairs, virtual speakers. So they could reach out to all of these administrations and see if they could provide a message to college students. The news, I know a lot of youth are very active in viewing the news now, so trying to stay informed. So it wouldn't be too difficult to get their message out to youth voters in terms of seeing how they could kind of tweak their campaign to also favor them, if you get what I'm saying.
So have you seen, and I agree with you wholeheartedly, yes, we can't go out and do the traditional campaigning, but we do have this incredible tool at our disposal called, you know, the internet. So we can have these kind of virtual, you know, connections. We can do TV on the internet. We can definitely engage on social media. Have you started to see, you know, what you talked about? Are you seeing enough of the candidate surrogates or people that work for the campaign reaching out to students? Or are you feeling like they're getting the message that you guys want to be talked to, you want it to be listened to? Do you think it's catching on?
I feel as though they are attempting to use technology more. I know that Joe Biden has utilized a couple of celebrities who are more engaged with youth voters to provide a newer message or a tailored message to us. But definitely more use of these methods would help, especially with Kamala being picked as the vice presidential nominee for him. And again, like I said, reaching out to university administrations and seeing if you can provide some sort of message, some sort of event to let younger voters know that you care about them, you hear them, you see their struggles in the streets, you know that some BIPOC students are fearing for their lives walking out on the street. So how are you going to make them feel safe enough to go out and vote for you? You know what I'm saying? So
No, absolutely. And I'm glad to hear that you are articulating so well what the issues are that students are thinking about, and what elected officials or those who choose who hope to be in elected office come November, that they have a clear vision of what's important to students. If you had to identify for me, I'm gonna let you go, but I want to ask you 3 influencers that you think would move the student vote in a huge way, so we get way past that 28% engagement. Who are those top 3 influencers?
that is a hard question.
You're a smart young lady. You can answer it.
There are a lot of influence. Okay. I know
See,
that.
I'm gonna try to hook it up for you. That's why I'm asking you.
I know.
I got inside connections with the campaign. So if you tell me who they are, I'm gonna get those names passed on.
Yes, definitely. I know that Cardi B has definitely been a very prominent figure in terms of voicing her opinions out in a more understandable way for youth voters. So I think that she would be a good force to keep working with, along with if we're gonna reach out to big influencers, then Beyonce has a very large following.
Start big with this. Come
Very
on.
influential.
I'm writing this down. Cardi B, Beyonce. Who's number 3?
And
All man up in there. We got to appeal to those male youth student voters.
yes, I'm thinking about male influencers. I don't follow many, but anybody in a music industry or an acting industry. I can't think of a name right now.
John Legend. Maybe
John Legend.
Okay.
Yes, write his name down. But anybody who's higher up there who has a large social following would definitely be effective.
Well, I thank you, Kaitlyn, for the great work that you're doing on the ground. Thank you for representing, the student vote so well. Keep on doing that work. Stay on the front lines, and I'm gonna get these 3 names passed on and see if we can hook something up for you. So if you see Cardi, drop something on Instagram, you'll say, "Oh, good. That's because I recommended her on that interview on the special report."
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for the great work that you're doing, and stay safe out there.
You too. Thank you.
Thanks to all of my guests. I just love this show. I love talking about how people can exercise their rights. As a civil rights lawyer, nothing makes me happier than people exercising their constitutional rights. So again, thanks to all of my guests, and thanks to you for joining me today. Big shout out to my production team and our sponsors. You can continue to be a part of this conversation by following me on all social platforms at Ariva Martin. And if you have questions about where to vote, or you've not registered to vote yet, please go to usa.gov/voting for information on how you can vote, even during the midst of COVID. You possibly live in one of those states where you can get a mail-in ballot, you can fill it out at home, drop it off, and there you've exercised your constitutional rights. Before I get out, always words to live by. Voting should be as easy and as convenient as possible. And in many cases, it is not. In too many cases across this country, politicians are making it difficult by passing measures, making it harder to cast your ballot. And unfortunately, Donald Trump and the Republican Party have decided that if everyone who is eligible to vote is able to vote, he will lose. And this fear of losing in November is driving Trump and active groups led by the Republican National Committee to do their best to limit who has access to the ballot and to manipulate the outcome of races from the White House to state houses. In a democracy, when you try to cut off citizens from being able to access their vote, You are undermining the Constitution and their constitutional rights. And this should scare the crap out of every American, despite your party affiliation. So as we celebrate the historic selection of Kamala Harris to the Democratic presidential ticket, we must remain vigilant and do everything in our power to make sure that everyone we know registers to vote and actually cast a ballot in the upcoming election. Don't get distracted by fake news on Twitter and Instagram. Don't let someone tell you that because Kanye is a talented rapper and artist and because he has cool tennis shoes that he's qualified to run this country. And if you have concerns about standing in lines to vote because of the pandemic, you can request a ballot from your state elections office. If you don't trust the mail, you can walk that ballot into a drop box or a polling place. Our grands and our great-grands had to endure physical attacks from state-sanctioned police and dogs in order to exercise their right to vote. They were willing to risk life and limb to preserve this democracy. They did it for me, they did it for you, and we owe it to them and to future generations to vote each and every election. As my millennial kids would say, we can't let the parentals down. We can't let them down this November. I'm out, y'all. Be safe out there. And remember, we are all in this together.